What if the people sworn to protect you were the ones pulling the trigger? A journalist uncovers a web of corruption inside the Atlanta Police Department, but when the truth gets too close, he becomes the hunted, framed, chased, left for dead. With only one shot at exposing the system, he must decide: run for his life or risk everything for justice. Because in this game, the only way to win is to survive. David Carter had spent years digging into the kind of stories most people were too afraid to touch. His name had become synonymous with exposing corruption, unearthing scandals, and putting powerful figures under the microscope. Some people called him relentless. Others called him reckless. But David never cared much for labels. His work at the Atlanta Gazette wasn't about fame. It was about the truth. On paper, Atlanta was a city of progress, a place where businesses thrived and culture flourished. But David knew the reality was far messier. Tensions between law enforcement and the community had been simmering for years, boiling over into protests that made national headlines. People spoke of justice, but the system had a way of protecting its own. Some officers believed they were untouchable, and in many cases, they were right. David had learned that the hard way. 2 years ago, he had been on the verge of publishing an explosive report on a network of corrupt officers running an extortion ring within the Atlanta Police Department. The evidence was airtight: sworn statements from whistleblowers, financial records linking officers to criminal enterprises, even surveillance footage of back-alley deals. But just as the article was set to go live, his primary source vanished. His editor received a legal notice from a high-powered law firm warning of severe consequences if they moved forward. The story was buried, and David was left with nothing but unanswered questions and a deep-seated frustration that never fully went away. He had promised himself that if he ever got another chance to take them down, he wouldn't let anything stop him. Now, that chance had come knocking. For weeks, he had been working on a new investigation, one that traced a pattern of police brutality cases, each dismissed without consequence. Witnesses had been intimidated, evidence had disappeared, and the same names kept surfacing in reports. One name, in particular, stood out: Officer Todd Reynolds. Reynolds wasn't just another cop with a heavy hand. He was the kind of officer who made people afraid to speak up. The kind whose victims often had records that made them easy to discredit. The kind who could get away with almost anything. David had been gathering testimonies, trying to piece together a case that couldn't be ignored. He knew he was onto something, but he also knew that the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous things would become. That night, as he sat in a dimly lit corner of a bar on Peachtree Street, he noticed Reynolds watching him. The officer wasn't in uniform, but there was no mistaking him. Square jaw, close-cropped hair, the kind of posture that carried an unspoken warning. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second before Reynolds took a sip from his glass. His expression unreadable. David didn't flinch. He finished his drink, left a few bills on the table, and walked out into the humid Georgia night. He didn't expect to hear footsteps behind him. As he made his way to his car, a police cruiser was parked across the street, its engine idling softly. The moment he stepped off the curb, the headlights flicked on. The car didn't move, didn't flash its sirens, just sat there, waiting. David took his time unlocking the driver's side door, forcing himself to appear unfazed. He slid in, started the ignition, and pulled into traffic. The cruiser followed, block after block. It kept its distance but never turned away. David's fingers tightened around the wheel. This wasn't a routine patrol. It was a message. After a few miles, the cruiser finally peeled off onto another street, vanishing into the city. David exhaled. It wasn't the first time he had been followed, and if he was right about this story, it wouldn't be the last. When he reached his apartment, he found a manila envelope waiting on his doorstep. There was no return address, no markings, just his name. He picked it up, stepped inside, and locked the door behind him. His hands were steady as he peeled back the flap. Inside was a single photograph. It was him, standing in a parking lot 6 months ago, shaking hands with a man named Luis Ortega. Luis had been his key source in an old case, a former gang member who had turned his life around and agreed to testify against dirty cops in exchange for witness protection. But Luis had never made it to the witness stand. His body had been found in an abandoned warehouse 2 weeks before the trial. His death ruled a gang-related execution. David had never believed that story. And someone knew it. Scrawled across the bottom of the photo were 4 words. Know when to stop. David stared at it for a long moment, then placed the envelope on his desk. If they thought a vague threat would scare him off, they didn't know him very well. The streets of Atlanta had an uneasy stillness that night, the kind that made the city feel heavier than usual. David drove through familiar roads, his mind still replaying the image of the envelope waiting at his door. The threat scrawled across the photograph inside. He had received warnings before, subtle hints that he was stepping too close to something dangerous. This, however, was different. Someone wanted him to know they were watching. The glow of a red traffic light bathed the intersection in a dim haze. As David waited, he glanced in his rearview mirror. A pair of headlights had been trailing him for the last few blocks. At first, he had chalked it up to coincidence, just another car on the road. But the way it moved, how it seemed to slow when he did and keep the exact same distance, told him otherwise. When the light turned green, David continued forward, keeping his speed steady. The vehicle behind him did the same. He turned onto a quieter street, hoping to confirm his suspicions. The car followed. Then, the sirens blared. Flashing blue and red lights filled his mirrors as the cruiser signaled him to pull over. David clenched his jaw. He knew better than to ignore it, even if he hadn't done anything wrong. Failing to comply would only escalate the situation. He eased his car onto the shoulder and rolled down the window, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. The heavy thud of boots on pavement grew louder as the officer approached. "Step out of the vehicle," a voice ordered. David turned his head. Officer Todd Reynolds stood just outside the window, one hand resting casually on the grip of his holstered gun. His expression was unreadable, but there was something calculated about the way he was looking at David, like a man who already knew exactly how this conversation was going to play out. David remained seated. "What's the reason for the stop?" Reynolds tilted his head. "You were speeding." David exhaled slowly. He had been watching his speedometer the entire time. "I don't think that's accurate." Reynolds smirked. "Are you refusing to comply?" The challenge was clear. David could push back, but that would give Reynolds an excuse to escalate things. Instead, he nodded and reached for the door handle. "I'm stepping out." As soon as he was on the pavement, Reynolds took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "Hands on the car," he instructed. David complied. He felt the officer's hands patting him down, rougher than necessary, searching for something that wasn't there. "You carrying anything I should know about?" Reynolds asked. "No," David replied. "Let's make sure of that." Without waiting for permission, Reynolds moved toward the driver's side and began searching the vehicle. No warrant, no explanation, just the quiet audacity of a man who believed rules didn't apply to him. David's fingers curled slightly against the hood of his car. He had dealt with intimidation tactics before, but there was something more personal about this. Across the street, a woman stood near a convenience store, her phone in hand. She wasn't recording, not yet, just watching, hesitating. David caught her gaze for a moment. She looked away. "Let me save you some time," David said, his voice measured. "You're not going to find anything." Reynolds closed the glove compartment with an unnecessary slam and straightened. "That's not really the point, is it?" He took a step closer. "You've been looking into things you shouldn't." David met his stare. "I report the truth." Reynolds exhaled a short laugh, shaking his head. "Truth? That's a funny word coming from you." He glanced at the woman still watching across the street. "You think any of this matters? People forget, they move on, and the ones who don't." He let the sentence trail off. David didn't flinch. He reached for his phone, intending to start recording. Reynolds saw it coming. Before David could unlock the screen, the officer snatched the phone from his grip and flung it onto the pavement. The screen cracked upon impact. David inhaled sharply through his nose, forcing himself to remain calm. Reynolds took a step back, dusting off his hands as if nothing had happened. "Consider this friendly advice, Carter. Some stories aren't worth telling." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The night seemed to stretch, filled with the weight of things unspoken. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, Reynolds took a step back and gestured toward the car. Get out of here. David studied him for a beat longer before picking up his damaged phone and slipping back into the driver's seat. He didn't bother looking back as he pulled away. His pulse was steady, but his mind was racing. By the time he reached his apartment, the exhaustion of the night was starting to settle in. He rubbed his temple, reached for his phone, and powered it back on despite the cracked screen. A notification popped up. One new message, no contact name, just a number he didn't recognize. He tapped it open. You're just getting started, Carter. Be careful. David exhaled slowly. He stared at the message for a long moment, then set the phone down on the table. The threat had just become real. David walked into the newsroom of the Atlanta Gazette, forcing himself to maintain an air of normalcy. The hum of printers, the distant sound of fingers clacking against keyboards, the faint scent of old coffee, none of it had changed. But something felt off. He nodded at a few colleagues, exchanged a half-hearted greeting with an editor, then made his way to his office. The door was slightly ajar. That wasn't right. He always closed it before leaving. Pushing it open, he stopped. His desk was a mess. Papers scattered, drawers half open, his computer screen black despite having left it in sleep mode. David sat down, pressing the power button on his laptop. It took longer than usual to boot up, and when it did, the folder containing his latest investigation notes was gone. Not moved, not misplaced, erased. His stomach tightened. Someone had been here, and they hadn't been subtle about it. Then he noticed the envelope. It sat in the center of his desk. A plain manila folder with no markings. The weight of it felt ominous, like whatever was inside had the power to shift the ground beneath him. He peeled it open, pulling out a single photograph. Lisa Martinez. She stood outside the gas station where she had seen Reynolds harassing him the night before. The photo was grainy, taken from a distance, but there was no mistaking her face. At the bottom of the picture, a message was scrawled in red ink. She might stay quiet forever. David exhaled through his nose, gripping the edge of his desk. They weren't just watching him. They were watching anyone who could back up his story. His first instinct was to call Lisa, warn her. But his gut told him she already knew. That's why she hadn't picked up his calls since last night. Instead, he pulled out his phone and dialed a different number. Jake Morrison answered on the second ring. Tell me you're not calling because you did something stupid, Jake said. David almost laughed. Define stupid. Jesus, what happened? David hesitated, looking at the photo again. I think I just got my answer about how far these guys are willing to go. There was silence on the other end. Then Jake sighed. Meet me at the diner on 14th. 15 minutes. David grabbed his coat and left. The diner was quiet, a relic from the past with worn-out booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. Jake sat in a corner booth, nursing a coffee that looked like it had been brewed sometime last week. David slid into the seat across from him, placing the envelope between them. Jake didn't touch it, just gave him a look. Who's in it? Lisa Martinez. Jake frowned. The witness? David nodded. Jake picked up the photograph. Examining it, they're not even trying to hide it anymore. Which means they think they don't have to. Jake rubbed a hand over his face. Listen to me, David. If they're bold enough to break into your office, to threaten witnesses, you're not dealing with just a few bad cops. This is bigger. David already knew that, but hearing it out loud made it feel heavier. You think it's connected to your last case? Jake asked. David didn't answer right away. His last big case, the one that got buried, had vanished too easily. Witnesses disappeared, records sealed. He had always suspected it went deeper than just a few corrupt officers. But he never had enough proof. Now, it felt like he was circling the same abyss again. I need to talk to Lisa, David said. Jake leaned back, shaking his head. She won't talk to you. And if she has any sense, she's already making plans to leave town. David clenched his jaw. Then I have to stop her before she does. By the time he reached Lisa's apartment, the sky had darkened, casting the city in a glow of flickering streetlights and neon signs. He knocked once. No answer. He knocked again. Firmer this time. Nothing. David pulled out his phone and tried calling. Straight to voicemail. His grip tightened around the device. If she had any doubts about whether she was in danger, she wouldn't anymore. And that meant she was either running, or someone had already gotten to her. David turned away, heading back to his car. He would try again tomorrow. The moment he stepped into his apartment, he knew something was wrong. The door was locked, just as he had left it, but the air inside felt disturbed, like someone had been there recently. David's eyes swept the living room. Nothing was missing. The couch, the bookshelves, even the framed photographs on the wall. Everything was exactly where it should be. But then he saw his office. The door was slightly open. David approached cautiously, pushed it open. His desk was in chaos. Papers were scattered across the floor. His laptop was gone. His filing cabinet was open. Drawers pulled out. They weren't looking for valuables. They were looking for something specific. David's stomach turned. They wanted him to know they could reach him anytime, anywhere. His hands curled into fists at his sides. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was a warning. He turned toward the front door, his mind racing. He needed to move, needed to find Lisa before they did, needed to. Then he stopped. Something on the floor, near the window. A small, black object. David crouched, picking it up. A USB drive. Someone had left it there. He turned it over in his fingers, a cold feeling creeping into his chest. Then his gaze lifted to the window, and his breath caught. Outside, on the sidewalk across the street, a figure stood beneath the glow of a street lamp. Officer Todd Reynolds, watching, waiting. At 3 a.m., David stayed frozen for a long moment, gripping the USB drive. Then Reynolds turned, walked back into the shadows, and disappeared. David sat at a corner table in a small cafe on Edgewood Avenue, stirring a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His eyes flickered between the entrance and his phone screen. The USB drive from the night before sat in his pocket, a constant weight pressing against his thoughts. He hadn't plugged it in yet. Something told him once he did, there would be no turning back. Across from him sat his source, a man in his late 40s with weary eyes and a twitchy demeanor. His name was Eric Hall, a former city records clerk who had agreed to meet under the condition that they kept it brief. He was the kind of man who had spent years looking the other way. But now, either out of guilt or self-preservation, he had decided to talk. David leaned in. What did you find? Eric wiped his palms on his jeans before pulling out a crumpled folder. Paper trails, internal memos, cases that were supposed to be investigated but got buried instead. He slid the folder across the table. It all points back to Reynolds and his unit. And someone higher up is making sure they don't face consequences. David flipped through the pages, his pulse quickening. This was exactly what he needed. Evidence, names, patterns. He was about to ask Eric more when a shadow passed over the table. David Carter? The voice was cold, mechanical. David looked up. 2 uniformed officers stood beside him, hands resting on their belts. The cafe fell silent. Stand up, one of them ordered. You're under arrest. David's stomach dropped. For what? The officer pulled out a pair of cuffs. Possession of a controlled substance. A murmur spread through the cafe. David's jaw tightened. That's a lie. The officer didn't flinch. Turn around. David glanced at Eric, who shrank into his seat, eyes darting toward the door like he was already planning his escape. David could push back, demand a warrant, but he knew how this would play out. They wanted a scene. They wanted to drag him out of here looking guilty. So he took a breath and stood. The metal cuffs snapped around his wrists. The holding cell smelled of sweat and disinfectant, a combination that settled into David's lungs like something permanent. He sat on the hard bench, staring at the walls, knowing exactly how this had been orchestrated. The drugs had probably been planted in his car sometime the night before. Maybe when they broke into his apartment. Maybe earlier. It didn't matter. They didn't need real proof. Just enough of a story to stain his name. The door opened with a low creak. Lieutenant Mark Davidson walked in, his presence filling the room before he even spoke. He was older than Reynolds, lean with a head of neatly combed silver hair and a face that could have belonged to a respected officer, if not for the cold calculation in his eyes. Behind him, Reynolds followed, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. David didn't move. Davidson sat down across from him, folding his hands on the table. I'll make this simple, he said. You plead guilty, pay a fine, maybe serve a little time. Then you walk away from all of this. David stared at him. I'm not pleading to something I didn't do. Davidson exhaled, shaking his head as if David were a child refusing to listen. Let me tell you what's going to happen. You'll sit in here while we let the media paint you as another fallen journalist. A disgraced writer who got caught up in something dirty. People love that kind of story. He leaned in slightly. Or, you can make it easier on yourself and admit to the charges. We make this go away. David didn't blink. You're scared. Davidson chuckled, as if the very idea amused him. Of what? That I'll keep digging. That people will start paying attention. Reynolds stepped forward, placing a hand on Davidson's chair. You really don't get it. Do you? He tilted his head. You think anyone gives a damn about what happens to some reporter? You think you're special? He tapped a finger against the table. You don't run things here. Carter. We do. David let the silence stretch. Then he smiled. Not wide, just enough to let them know he wasn't broken yet. You sound nervous. Reynolds. The officer's smirk flickered for a fraction of a second. Davidson exhaled sharply, pushing back his chair. Fine. Let him sit here for a few more hours. See if he's still feeling brave. He nodded toward Reynolds, then strode out. Reynolds lingered for a moment. You keep playing this game. Carter, you're gonna lose. David held his gaze. We'll see about that. It was nearly midnight when Jake finally pushed through the doors of the station. His suit slightly rumpled, his expression unreadable. He spoke to the desk sergeant in a low voice before making his way toward the holding area. Get up, Jake said as soon as he saw David. You're leaving. David arched a brow. That easy? Jake scoffed. Nothing about this is easy. As soon as they stepped outside, David took a breath of the cool night air. He expected to feel relief. He didn't. What happened? He asked as they walked toward Jake's car. Couple of your colleagues at the Gazette started asking questions about your arrest. Enough noise. And they couldn't keep you locked up without more evidence. David nodded. They'll try again. Jake unlocked the car. No doubt. They pulled onto the street. The city quiet in the way only a late night could make it. Then David caught it. A car. Dark. No sirens. No lights. Following them from a distance. Jake must have noticed too. That one of theirs? David watched the car keep pace behind them. He wasn't sure. But this time, it wasn't a police cruiser. David kept his gaze on the rearview mirror, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. The dark sedan had been following them for the last 15 minutes. Keeping a steady distance, never getting too close, but never backing off either. Jake noticed it too. We need to lose them, he muttered, shifting in his seat. David nodded, taking a sudden turn onto a busier street, weaving through traffic. If they were dealing with professionals, they wouldn't panic. They'd keep their pace, play it cool. But David had spent years tracking people, and he knew all the tricks. Hang on, he said, cutting across 2 lanes and merging onto an avenue packed with late-night taxis and delivery trucks. The sedan hesitated for half a second, just enough for David to confirm they were tailing him. Still there? Jake asked, glancing over his shoulder. Yeah, David muttered. They're not even trying to be subtle anymore. He made another sharp turn and pulled into a brightly lit gas station. Parking near the air pump, he kept the engine running and reached for his phone, pretending to call for assistance. Jake stayed still, watching the sedan as it idled across the street. Whoever they are, they're waiting for us to make the next move, Jake said. David exhaled, then made a decision. He pushed open the door, stepping out casually as if he had nothing to hide. Keeping his movements relaxed, he strolled toward the convenience store entrance, then abruptly changed direction toward the sedan. The driver must have realized what he was doing, because the engine roared to life. Tires screeched as the car peeled away. Speeding down the road, David barely caught a glimpse of the driver. But he saw enough. Male, short hair, face obscured by shadows. But he got the plate number. He hurried back to the car. We need to run that plate. Now. Back at Jake's office, the 2 men sat in silence as Jake typed the numbers into his database. The screen flickered, then displayed a name David hadn't seen in years. Ethan Cole. David leaned in. That can't be right. Jake's expression was grim. It's him. David ran a hand down his face. Cole's been gone for 2 years. He disappeared after that internal affairs investigation. Everyone thought he skipped town. Apparently not. Jake scrolled through the data. According to the records, his badge was never officially revoked. He resigned, but there was no formal paperwork beyond that. It's like he just vanished. David's mind raced. Cole had been deep undercover, investigating corruption inside the Atlanta Police Department before suddenly dropping off the grid. His departure had always seemed suspicious, but no one had been able to prove anything. If Cole was back, it meant something was happening beneath the surface. Something bigger than just Reynolds and Davidson. David looked at Jake. We need to find him. Jake sighed. Finding a guy who's been off the radar for 2 years? That's not exactly easy. David grabbed his jacket. Then we start with the last person who saw him alive. Lisa Martinez's apartment was dark when David arrived. Too dark. He knocked. No answer. Tried calling. Straight to voicemail. David's gut told him something was wrong. He pulled out his phone and called a contact at the Gazette. Hey, I need a favor. Can you check if there have been any recent searches on Lisa Martinez in the police database? The line went quiet for a moment. Then his colleague replied, That's weird. David stiffened. What is? Someone accessed her records this morning. But here's the thing. There's no log of who did it. It's like the request was erased right after it was made. David's stomach sank. She's gone, isn't she? Another pause. Then, looks that way. David lowered the phone, staring at the empty apartment door. She hadn't just left. Someone had made her disappear. When he returned home, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. His apartment felt colder than usual, though he wasn't sure if it was the temperature or just his nerves catching up to him. He dropped his keys on the counter, sat down at his desk, and opened his laptop. His inbox was full of unread messages, most of them from colleagues or sources. But one stood out. No sender, no subject, just a single line of text. If you keep looking for Lisa, you'll end up just like her. David stared at the words, his pulse steady but his mind racing. They were watching. They knew his every move, and they were one step ahead. David sat in his car outside a rundown bar on the outskirts of Atlanta, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. The neon sign above the entrance flickered, casting a weak, buzzing glow on the sidewalk. He had spent the past hour combing through old reports, searching for any trace of Ethan Cole before his abrupt disappearance. The search had led him here, a place that had once been frequented by off-duty cops looking to drink in peace. Away from prying eyes, he killed the engine and stepped out, feeling the weight of the night settle on his shoulders. The bar smelled of stale beer and cigarette smoke, the kind of place where time moved slower, where regulars kept their heads down and newcomers were noticed immediately. David approached the counter, scanning the room. A bartender with salt and pepper hair was drying a glass with the kind of patience that came from years of watching and listening. David slid onto a stool, looking for someone who used to come here a lot. Ethan Cole. Name ring a bell? The bartender didn't look up. Haven't heard that name in a long time. David leaned in. He was investigating cops. Then he vanished. I need to know why. The bartender finally set the glass down. You're not the first person to ask about him, he said quietly, but you might be the last if you don't start watching your back. David's pulse quickened. Who else came looking? A pause. Then the bartender wiped his hands on a rag and nodded toward the exit. If I were you, I'd leave through the back. Someone's been watching you since you walked in. David kept his expression neutral as he stood and made his way toward the back door, his instincts screaming at him to stay alert. The parking garage was nearly empty, the overhead lights humming faintly as David stepped into the cool night air. He walked toward his car, every muscle in his body tense. Then he heard footsteps, too fast, too deliberate. Before he could react, someone grabbed him from behind, shoving him against a concrete pillar. Pain exploded in his ribs as a fist connected with his side. A voice, low and steady, spoke in his ear. Stop digging, Carter. Some secrets aren't worth dying for. David gritted his teeth. You must think I scare easy. The second attacker struck him hard across the face, sending him stumbling. David tasted blood. He staggered but didn't fall. He forced his vision to focus, catching a glimpse of the two men, plain clothes, built like cops. One of them had something tucked under his jacket. A badge. Dirty cops. One of them reached for something in his coat. Maybe a weapon. Maybe something worse. But before he could pull it out, a deep voice barked from the entrance of the garage. Hey, get away from him. A security guard, late 40s, heavy set, standing near the doorway with a flashlight in one hand and a phone in the other. The two men hesitated for a split second, just enough for David to make his move. He threw his weight forward, slamming his shoulder into one of them. The guy stumbled, and David used the opening to lunge toward his car. By the time he yanked the door open and threw himself inside, the two men had already turned and disappeared into the shadows. David sat there for a moment, catching his breath. His ribs ached, his lip was split, but he was still standing. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to Jake. Need you to run a plate. Now. It took Jake less than 10 minutes to get back to him. The car is registered to a current APD officer. David exhaled slowly, staring at the message. That meant only one thing. They weren't just covering for dirty cops from the past. Some of them were still on the force. Back at his apartment, David sat at his desk, pressing an ice pack against his jaw. His laptop was open, files and notes spread out across the table. His body ached, but his mind was sharp, cutting through the pain as he pieced everything together. Then his phone buzzed. No caller ID. He hesitated, then answered. A voice, calm and unfamiliar, spoke on the other end. I have proof that can bring them all down. But we meet on my terms. David leaned forward. Who are you? A pause. Then the voice said, let's just say I know exactly how deep the rot goes. David's grip tightened around the phone. Where do we meet? The voice gave him an address. A place on the edge of the city. Come alone. The caller added, or don't come at all. The line went dead. David sat back, staring at the dark screen. He had no idea who this person was. But if they were telling the truth, he was closer than ever to exposing everything. The boneyard of an old parking lot stretched before David. Cracked pavement and rusted light poles casting eerie shadows under the dim glow of a single working bulb. The place had been abandoned for years. Just another forgotten space in Atlanta where deals were made and secrets were buried. David stepped out of his car, his breath steady despite the weight of uncertainty pressing against his ribs. The night smelled of asphalt and something damp, the kind of scent that clung to places no one had reason to visit. He scanned the lot, looking for movement. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. Sam. Torres moved like a man who had spent too long watching his back. His frame was wiry, his posture rigid, like someone expecting a punch at any moment. His clothes were plain, dark jeans, a hooded jacket zipped halfway up, but his eyes carried the weariness of a man who had seen too much. You came alone, Sam noted, stopping a few feet away. You said I had to. David replied. Sam hesitated, then pulled a small USB drive from his pocket. He tossed it to David, who caught it with one hand. That's everything, Sam said. Names, reports, internal memos they thought were destroyed. Reynolds, Davidson, and half a dozen others, some still active, some already gone. David turned the device in his fingers. And Ethan Cole? Sam's expression tightened. There's a file on him too. David studied the man. Why now? Why help me? Sam exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand over his jaw. I spent years trying to take them down from the inside. Thought if I played by the rules, built a solid case, the system would do the rest. But the system is the problem. His eyes darkened. You already know that, though. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. David pocketed the USB. Then let's bring it into the light. Sam gave a dry chuckle. You don't get it. This isn't just a few bad cops. It's bigger than that. City Hall. Prosecutors. Judges. They don't just bury cases. They bury people. He took a step closer. Voice low. If you really want to take this public, you're gonna need more than an article. You need people. You need the city to give a damn. David nodded, feeling the weight of the truth pressing heavier against his chest. Then I make them care. Sam's jaw clenched. Be careful, Carter. You're not just exposing them. You're making yourself the next problem to be solved. David had barely left the parking lot when he noticed the headlights. The black sedan slid into traffic behind him, keeping a steady distance, not too close, not too far. His fingers tightened around the wheel. He made a sharp right, cutting through a residential street. The sedan followed. His pulse quickened. He had spent enough time tailing people to know what a pursuit looked like. Whoever was in that car wasn't just heading in the same direction. They were hunting him. He pressed his foot against the gas, weaving through side streets, testing them. They didn't back off. David's eyes flicked to the freeway entrance up ahead. He made a decision and took it, merging into the late-night traffic. The sedan followed. He gritted his teeth. They weren't going to let him go. David pushed the speedometer past 70, dodging between cars, trying to create distance. The sedan sped up, closing in. Then he saw it. A highway patrol checkpoint half a mile ahead. David made his move. He veered sharply across 2 lanes, cutting into the checkpoint's path. The sedan hesitated. Then, as if realizing they were about to drive straight into uniformed officers, they hit the brakes. David didn't look back. He blew past the checkpoint at a reasonable speed, gripping the wheel as he exhaled slowly. By the time he glanced in his mirror, the sedan was gone. Back in his apartment, David sat at his desk, his laptop open. The USB drive rested in his palm, its plastic casing smooth and deceptively ordinary. He plugged it in. Folders blinked onto the screen. Documents, spreadsheets, reports stamped with official seals. He scrolled through them, absorbing names, dates, cases that had been quietly erased. Then he saw it. A single video file, marked with only a date. David hesitated, then clicked. The screen flickered, then played grainy footage. A room, fluorescent lights buzzing, a man strapped to a chair, his face swollen and bloodied. Ethan Cole. David's stomach tightened. A voice, off camera, cold and detached. You thought you could run, Cole? That we wouldn't find you? Cole lifted his head weakly. Go to hell. A fist swung into frame, connecting with Cole's face. His head snapped back. David's fingers dug into the desk. The camera shifted slightly, revealing another figure stepping forward. Mark Davidson. David's breath came slow and measured, his skin cold. The screen faded to black. For a long moment, David didn't move. The city outside his window pulsed with life. Cars passing, distant sirens wailing. But in that moment, everything felt utterly still. He closed his laptop, his jaw tightening. Whatever had happened to Cole, it hadn't been an accident. And now, David had proof. David sat at his desk, the glow of his laptop screen the only light in the dimly lit apartment. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he stared at the video file still open on his screen. The image of Ethan Cole's battered face was burned into his mind. But it wasn't just the brutality that rattled him, it was who had been standing over Cole, delivering the blows. Mark Davidson. The implications were massive. This wasn't just corruption, it was sanctioned violence within the Atlanta Police Department. And Davidson wasn't just some rogue cop, he was a man with power. The kind that didn't answer to anyone. David reached for his phone and dialed the number Sam Torres had given him. It rang once, twice, then a robotic voice cut in. The number you were trying to reach is no longer in service. His stomach tightened. He tried again. Same result. David grabbed his keys and jacket, his pulse quickening. Sam had known too much. He had warned David that this was bigger than just a few bad cops, that it stretched all the way to the top. And now, Sam was gone. The parking lot where they had met the night before was empty. No sign of struggle, no blood, no broken glass, just an absence that felt deliberate, as if someone had made sure no trace of Sam remained. David scanned the area, listening to the distant hum of the city. If Sam had disappeared, it meant someone had wanted him out of the picture. And if they had gotten to Sam, they could get to anyone, including David. His fingers curled into fists. They were trying to erase the truth. But he wasn't going to let them. Back at the Atlanta Gazette, David paced outside the editor's office, the weight of the USB drive in his pocket heavier than ever. His editor, Karen Walsh, sat behind her desk, flipping through the printouts of the documents David had given her. She was an old-school journalist, the kind who believed in integrity but also knew the dangers of publishing something that could bring down an entire department. This is dangerous, she said finally, setting the papers down. You know that, right? David leaned forward. That's why it needs to be out there. Karen exhaled. If we run this without absolute confirmation, we could be facing legal threats. If we get one thing wrong, just one, they'll destroy you. And they'll drag this paper down with you. David didn't back down. I have a video. That's as real as it gets. She hesitated. Show it to me. David pulled out his laptop and clicked play. Karen watched in silence as the grainy footage unfolded, her lips pressing into a thin line. When the screen finally went black, she sat back, rubbing her temples. This could start a war, she muttered. Good, David said. That means it's worth fighting. But Karen wasn't convinced. I need time to verify this. To talk to legal. I can't just publish it overnight. David clenched his jaw. He knew what needing time meant. It meant pressure from above. Phone calls from officials who wanted to bury this before it ever saw the light of day. And sure enough, within hours, the first counterattack came. A headline surfaced on a local news site. Disgraced journalist fabricates police corruption scandal for clicks. Then another. David Carter, the reporter who cried wolf. David scrolled through the articles. His name dragged through the mud. Accusations that he had doctored evidence. Claims that he had an anti-police agenda. Anonymous sources questioning his credibility. Jake called him minutes later. They're coming after you, he said bluntly. David ran a hand through his hair. Yeah, I noticed. You think Karen's gonna cave? She's stalling. I don't blame her. Jake sighed. You need to be careful. They're trying to discredit you first. If that doesn't work, they'll go for something worse. David exhaled. Then I need to push back. The Atlanta Police Department headquarters loomed ahead, its glass doors reflecting the city lights. David walked through them without hesitation, ignoring the glances from officers who recognized him. He wasn't here to be subtle. He spotted Reynolds near the front desk, casually chatting with another officer. The moment Reynolds saw David, his smile faltered. David closed the distance between them. We need to talk. Reynolds smirked, recovering quickly. That so? David crossed his arms. You've been busy. First a false arrest, now planting stories to make me look like a liar. Reynolds shrugged. I don't know what you're talking about. David leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough for Reynolds to hear. I know about Cole. I know what Davidson did to him. Reynolds' smirk twitched. For the first time, there was something else behind his eyes, something close to hesitation. David took that as a win. He wasn't sure how much Reynolds actually knew, but he had hit a nerve. You're playing a dangerous game, Carter, Reynolds muttered. You don't know who you're up against. David held his ground. Neither do you. A long silence stretched between them. Then Reynolds stepped back, smiling again, but it was forced. Watch yourself. David turned and walked out, his heart pounding. He had planted the seed of doubt. But as he stepped onto the sidewalk, his phone vibrated in his pocket. A text message, no name, just a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. Tonight will be your last. David stared at the words, the city humming around him. They were done with warnings. David walked out of the precinct, the cool night air pressing against his skin. The city buzzed around him, headlights flickering across wet pavement, the distant murmur of late-night traffic, the occasional echo of sirens in the background. But beneath all of that, something felt off. He wasn't alone. The weight of the threat from earlier still sat in his pocket. The message clear as day. Tonight will be your last. David forced himself to move naturally, crossing the street toward his car. His eyes flicked to his reflection in the storefront windows as he passed, scanning for movement behind him. A dark sedan idled at the corner, engine humming low. Maybe it was just paranoia. Or maybe it wasn't. Sliding into the driver's seat, he locked the doors and started the car. The glow of the dashboard lights illuminated his hands gripping the wheel. Knuckles tight, he pulled into traffic, keeping his speed steady. The sedan hesitated for a moment before following. David's pulse quickened. Another turn. The car followed. This wasn't just surveillance, it was a hunt. Then, out of nowhere, a black pickup truck surged from the cross street, cutting him off. Tires screeched as David slammed on the brakes, his car skidding sideways. Before he could react, The truck swerved toward him again, forcing him toward the curb. David's instincts screamed at him. This wasn't a warning. They weren't just trying to intimidate him anymore. They were trying to kill him. He wrenched the wheel, accelerating toward the nearest alley. His tires barely found traction as he turned sharply, the truck roaring behind him. The alley was narrow, littered with dumpsters and broken pallets. But David didn't slow down. Then, gunfire. A deafening crack shattered the night. The rear windshield exploded, glass raining over the backseat. David gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel as he swerved past a pile of crates. Another shot. This one tore into the side panel. He had to ditch the car. Ahead, the alley opened into a small courtyard behind an abandoned building. Without thinking, David yanked the emergency brake, sending the car into a controlled spin before throwing the door open. He ran. His heart pounded as he sprinted toward the nearest entrance, shoving the rusted door open. Darkness swallowed him as he slipped inside. Footsteps pounded against the pavement outside. They were still coming. David moved quickly, weaving through the debris inside the abandoned warehouse. The place smelled of mildew and decay, the remnants of a place long forgotten. He pressed himself against a wall, forcing his breath to steady as shadows passed outside the broken windows. Then his phone buzzed. The vibration felt deafening in the silence. David hesitated, then glanced at the screen. No caller ID. He answered. "You're lucky they're sloppy," a voice said, low, familiar. David's breath caught. "Who is this?" A pause. Then, "Ethan Cole." David's grip tightened around the phone. "That's impossible." "Yeah, well, I had a good reason to stay dead." Ethan muttered. "You don't, which means you need to move. Now." David's mind raced. "How do I know this isn't a setup?" "You don't, but if you stay where you are, you're not gonna make it till morning." David exhaled slowly. He didn't have the luxury of doubt. Where? Edge of the city. Boneyard storage yard. 2 hours. The line went dead. David pushed off the wall, his body still pulsing with adrenaline. Ethan Cole was alive, and he had answers. The storage yard was a graveyard of forgotten cargo. Stacked shipping containers loomed in the moonlight, casting jagged shadows over the cracked asphalt. David parked a block away, making the rest of the walk on foot. He kept to the edges, his senses sharp. Then he saw him. Ethan Cole stood between the containers, barely recognizable. His face was gaunt, his clothes worn, but his eyes still carried the same fire David remembered from the old reports. "You look like hell," David muttered. Ethan smirked. "Yeah, well, hell's got nice accommodations if you know the right people." David studied him. "You were tortured." Ethan rolled his shoulder, wincing slightly. "They needed to make sure I wasn't talking to the wrong people." "You faked your death." "Had to." Reynolds and Davidson weren't just covering for bad cops. They were running something bigger. "I got too close, so they tried to make sure I wouldn't come back." David crossed his arms. "Then why are you back now?" Ethan's expression darkened. "Because they're getting sloppy, and because someone else wants you dead more than they wanted me gone." David frowned. "What do you mean, someone else?" Ethan pulled something from his pocket, a small USB drive. He held it between his fingers. "I didn't send you the first one," he said. David stared at him. Ice crawled down his spine. If Ethan hadn't sent the first drive, then someone else had wanted him to find it. Someone had been feeding him information, knowing it would put a target on his back. David exhaled sharply. "Then who the hell is playing us?" Ethan tossed him the USB. "That's the million-dollar question." David caught it, his mind spinning. Whatever was on this drive, it was big enough that someone had risked using him as bait. And now, he was running out of time to figure out who. The air in the storage yard was thick with tension, the cold steel containers around them standing like silent witnesses. David could feel the weight of the USB drive in his pocket. But now, it felt like a ticking bomb rather than a key to the truth. Ethan stood across from him, his face illuminated only by the weak glow of a flickering floodlight overhead. "Let's cut to it," David said, his voice low. "You wouldn't risk showing up unless you had something that could burn them down for good." Ethan exhaled, running a hand over his stubbled jaw. "I was part of it," he admitted. "Not at first. When I joined the force, I actually believed in the job. Then I saw how it really worked. The deals, the silence, the way cases disappeared if they landed in the wrong hands. David didn't interrupt. He wanted to hear the whole story. Ethan continued, his voice edged with regret. I played along for a while. Took the easy way out. Turned a blind eye. But then I got assigned to an internal investigation. Digging into cops who took bribes from gangs. His lips pressed into a thin line. That's when I found out it wasn't just bribes. It was executions, cover-ups. They weren't just protecting criminals. They were running the whole damn show. David's pulse quickened. And you have proof? Ethan nodded. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small external hard drive. It's all here. Financial records, case files that were wiped from the system. But that's not the real bombshell. He hesitated, then locked eyes with David. There's a video. David felt his stomach tighten. Of what? Ethan swallowed hard. A witness. A guy who was ready to testify against Davidson and Reynolds. They took him into an interrogation room. No cameras, no records, but someone managed to film it from a hidden angle. David could barely breathe. What happened to the witness? Ethan's jaw clenched. They beat him to death. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. If this gets out, Ethan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. It's over for them. The whole department will collapse. David reached for the hard drive. Then let's make sure it does. But before Ethan could hand it over, a sound shattered the night. A gunshot. David flinched as Ethan staggered back, his breath hitching. A dark stain spread across his shirt as his knees buckled. David lunged forward, catching him before he hit the ground. Ethan gasped, gripping David's arm. They knew. David's head snapped up just as figures emerged from the shadows. Reynolds. Behind him, 3 more officers, their guns raised. Reynolds took a slow step forward, smirking. You really thought you were the hunter, Carter? He tilted his head. No, you've been the prey all along. David's pulse pounded in his ears. He was trapped, and the night wasn't over yet. David's pulse pounded in his ears. The cold steel of the shipping container pressed against his back as he crouched low, gripping the hard drive in his hand like a lifeline. The night air was thick with tension, broken only by the crunch of approaching footsteps. Reynolds' voice rang out, smooth and laced with satisfaction. Nowhere left to run. Carter. David tightened his jaw, his mind racing. Ethan lay motionless on the ground, his breath shallow, blood pooling beneath him. There was no saving him now. The only thing David could do was make sure his death wasn't for nothing. He darted forward, using the shadows between the containers to his advantage. The moment he moved, gunfire erupted behind him. Bullets ricocheted off metal, sparks flying in the darkness. David didn't look back. He sprinted through the maze of steel, weaving between rows of stacked cargo, searching for an exit. A shout, more footsteps. They were closing in. He spotted a gap between 2 containers and dove through just as another shot rang out. The bullet whizzed past his ear. So close he felt the heat of it. His body hit the ground hard. But he rolled and kept moving, ignoring the pain in his ribs. He needed a way out. Now. Then. Headlights. A car screeched to a stop at the edge of the yard. Engine revving. David barely had time to react before the vehicle accelerated, straight toward him. At the last second, he leapt aside, landing hard on his shoulder. The car didn't stop. It plowed into one of the officers behind him, sending the man flying. The driver's side door flew open. Jake, get in. David scrambled to his feet and lunged into the car just as another round of gunfire erupted. Jake slammed the gas, the tires screeching as they tore out of the shipping yard. In the rearview mirror, Reynolds stood with his gun raised, his face twisted in rage. He fired. The bullet punched through the back windshield, shattering glass. Hold on, Jake yelled. The car fishtailed onto the main road, dodging oncoming traffic. David gripped the dashboard, his breaths coming fast. How the hell did you find me? Jake swerved to avoid a parked truck. Tracked your phone. Figured you were in deep when you stopped answering. Good timing, David muttered. Yeah, well, don't thank me yet, Jake said. We're not out of this. Behind them, headlights appeared. A black SUV. Gaining fast. David's grip tightened on the hard drive. They're not letting us leave alive. Jake cursed under his breath and floored the accelerator. The car shot forward, weaving through the deserted streets. The SUV followed. Relentless. Glove compartment. Jake barked. David yanked it open. A loaded pistol sat inside. You serious? Jake gritted his teeth. You want to live or what? David grabbed the gun. He rolled down the window, bracing himself against the doorframe as he aimed. The SUV was close. Too close. He fired. The first shot missed. The second hit the grill. The SUV didn't slow down. Then, the return fire came. The windshield exploded. Jake cursed, ducking as glass rained over them. The car swerved violently, tires screeching. David barely had time to react before Jake let out a sharp gasp. Blood. David's stomach lurched as Jake's hand shot to his side, fingers slick with red. Jake's jaw clenched. I'm fine. Just. His breath hitched. Take the damn drive. He ripped the hard drive from David's grip and shoved it back at him. David's heart pounded. No, we're getting out of this. Another shot. Jake gritted his teeth, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. His breathing was ragged now, his body shaking. David, he rasped. Run. The car skidded around a corner, tires screaming. The SUV was seconds away. Jake took one last breath, then yanked the wheel hard. The car lurched violently, clipping a hydrant before slamming into a row of dumpsters. David barely had time to process before Jake shoved the door open, blood streaking his shirt. Go. David hesitated, but Jake shoved the hard drive into his chest. Now, the SUV screeched to a stop. Reynolds stepped out. David had no choice. He turned and ran. David's hands tightened around the steering wheel as he sped through the backstreets of Atlanta. The city blurred past, neon lights flashing across the windshield, but all he could focus on was the blood pooling beneath Jake's jacket. Stay with me, David muttered. Jake let out a ragged breath. I'm fine, he said, though his voice betrayed the lie. Just a little. Ventilation. David clenched his jaw. He needed to get Jake help, but they couldn't risk going to a regular hospital. The cops would be watching, waiting. If Reynolds and Davidson wanted him dead, they wouldn't hesitate to finish the job right in an parking lot. Instead, David took a sharp turn down an unmarked alley and stopped in front of a rundown clinic with boarded-up windows. It looked abandoned, but David knew better. This place had been operating in the shadows for years, treating people who couldn't go to the police, people like Jake. A woman in scrubs met them at the door. She took one look at Jake and waved them inside without a word. David helped lower Jake onto a table as the woman, Dr. Sonia Patel, a former trauma surgeon who had seen more bullet wounds than she cared to admit, pulled on gloves and got to work. You're lucky, she said as she cut away Jake's bloodied shirt. Bullet went clean through. No major organs hit. Jake gritted his teeth. Feels like it hit something important. David exhaled, his muscles finally unclenching. He gonna make it? Dr. Patel smirked. Depends if he stops talking long enough for me to stitch him up. Jake groaned. Great. Another doctor with an attitude. David let out a dry chuckle. But the relief was short-lived. He still had the hard drive. He still had a city ready to turn on him. And now, he had a wounded friend to protect. He needed a plan. Fast. An hour later, David sat in the clinic's back room, staring at his laptop. The hard drive sat next to him, a ticking time bomb waiting to be unleashed. He plugged it in. Files popped up on the screen. Hundreds of them. Financial records, case files, emails. But one file stood out. A video. David clicked it. The screen flickered, and suddenly, he was inside a dimly lit interrogation room. Ethan Cole sat in a chair, his hands cuffed behind his back. His face was swollen, one eye nearly shut from bruising. David's stomach turned. Then, two figures entered the frame. Reynolds and Davidson. David watched as the scene unfolded. The threats, the blows, the slow, systematic breaking of a man who had once worn the same badge as them. Then, the final moments. Ethan gasping for breath as Davidson pressed a knee against his throat. The same cold expression on his face. David closed the laptop, his pulse hammering. This was it, the proof, the undeniable truth. But it wouldn't mean anything if he didn't get it out before they silenced him for good. Outside, the city was already turning against him. News sites plastered his face across headlines. David Carter, murderer or martyr? Disgraced journalist suspected in Ethan Cole's death. From reporter to fugitive. How far will Carter run? David scrolled through the articles, his fists clenching. They were painting him as the villain, twisting the truth before he had a chance to speak it. Jake, now bandaged and sitting up, glanced over. They're closing in, he muttered. David nodded. We need to move fast. Jake gestured toward the laptop. How bad is it? David hesitated, then turned the screen toward him. Jake watched the video in silence, his jaw tightening. When it ended, he let out a slow breath. They're not gonna let you walk away from this. David nodded. Which is why I need to make sure this gets out before they find me. Jake leaned forward. So, what's the plan? David opened his mouth to answer. Then the first shot rang out. Glass shattered. The lights flickered. David barely had time to react before the front door burst open. Black-clad figures stormed in, weapons raised. Move, Jake shouted. David grabbed the laptop and the hard drive. Diving behind the overturned exam table as another shot blasted through the drywall. Dr. Patel screamed from the back room. But David couldn't focus on that now. He peeked around the corner. The gunman moved with precision, trained, efficient. These weren't just hired thugs. These were cops. Jake pulled a pistol from under his jacket and fired back, forcing the attackers to scatter. David's mind raced. They had seconds, maybe less, before they were boxed in. Back exit, Jake shouted. David sprinted toward the emergency exit, yanking the door open just as another bullet slammed into the frame. He stumbled outside, pulling Jake with him. They ran. The alley stretched into darkness. Dumpsters lining the brick walls. Footsteps pounded behind them. Then David made the mistake of looking back. Through the chaos, through the flashing gunfire, he saw him. Lieutenant Mark Davidson, standing just inside the clinic. His gun still raised. Watching. Waiting. David's breath caught. Davidson wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. He was leading the hunt himself. David and Jake crouched in the shadows of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The sound of sirens had faded into the distance, but they both knew it was only a matter of time before the hunt resumed. Blood still soaked through Jake's shirt, though he gritted his teeth and waved off any concern. We can't keep running, Jake muttered. David nodded. We don't have to. We just need to get the truth out first. He opened his laptop, fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard. He wasn't going to rely on traditional media anymore, not when every major network in Atlanta could be influenced by the same people who wanted him dead. Instead, he launched a live stream. The screen flickered to life. A blank background, no face, just his voice. My name is David Carter. And if you're watching this, it means they haven't silenced me yet. He clicked on the file, and the interrogation room video filled the screen. This is what they don't want you to see. He continued, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. This is what happens when the people meant to protect us believe they're untouchable. Ethan Cole's bruised face filled the frame. Then Reynolds. Then Davidson. The brutality played out in raw, unfiltered detail. David watched the viewer count spike. Hundreds. Then thousands. He sent the file to every journalist he could think of, national outlets, independent reporters, human rights organizations. Within minutes, social media exploded. The hashtags started trending. Hashtag justice for Ethan Cole. Hashtag Atlanta PD scandal. Jake exhaled. It's out there now. They can't bury this. David nodded. But they can still bury us. An hour later, the fallout had begun. The Atlanta Police Department released a statement calling the footage deeply concerning and promising an internal investigation. The mayor held an emergency press conference, vowing transparency, but David knew it was all damage control. The real danger wasn't the department. It was Reynolds. The first sign that something was wrong came when the power cut out. David and Jake exchanged glances. Then came the sound of footsteps. Heavy, measured. David barely had time to react before the door splintered inward. Reynolds stood in the doorway, his silhouette outlined against the moonlight. His eyes were cold, void of hesitation. He held a silenced pistol, its barrel steady. You should have just let this go. Carter, Reynolds said. David's muscles coiled. You don't get to decide who walks away from this. Reynolds smirked. I already did. Then he fired. David dove, the bullet shattering the wall behind him. He hit the ground hard, rolling just as Reynolds advanced. Jake, still weak from blood loss, grabbed a metal pipe from the floor and swung. Reynolds caught it midair. He twisted Jake's arm and sent him crashing to the floor. David scrambled to his feet, tackling Reynolds into a rusted shelf. The impact sent both men sprawling. The gun skidded across the floor, spinning out of reach. They grappled, fists landing in rapid succession. David blocked one hit, then another, but Reynolds was stronger, fueled by rage. He slammed David's head against the ground, dazing him. David gasped for air as Reynolds grabbed the gun. Game over, Reynolds muttered, raising the weapon. A gunshot rang out, but it wasn't Reynolds who fired. David blinked. Reynolds staggered, a look of shock crossing his face. Blood bloomed across his chest. Jake stood behind him, hands shaking around the pistol he had taken from David's bag. Reynolds dropped to his knees, his breath ragged. He didn't get to finish the sentence. He collapsed. Jake groaned, lowering the gun. That's for Ethan. David pushed himself up, chest heaving. For the first time in days, he realized Reynolds was gone. But the war wasn't over yet. Reynolds lay motionless on the warehouse floor, his blood pooling beneath him. The tension that had gripped David for days didn't fade, it simply shifted. The man was dead, but his last words clung to the air like smoke. A name. David had barely heard it, mumbled through gritted teeth as Reynolds' final breath rattled from his lungs. The name meant nothing to him. Yet, he turned to Jake, who was slumped against the wall, his face pale but determined. The gun still trembled in his grip, his fingers stained red from his own wound. We need to go, David said. Jake let out a shaky breath, nodding. David scooped up the laptop and hard drive, his mind racing. The livestream had done its job. There was no undoing what the world had already seen. But Davidson was still out there, and Reynolds' final words suggested this wasn't over. Not even close. By dawn, Atlanta was on fire, not in flames, but in outrage. The footage had spread like wildfire. News stations scrambled to keep up. Politicians distanced themselves from the scandal, and the public demanded answers. Then came the arrest. Mark Davidson was led out of his home in handcuffs, his face unreadable as cameras flashed around him. Reporters shouted questions, demanding an explanation. David watched it unfold on a muted television from a safe house, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He should have felt victorious. Instead, he felt uneasy. Davidson wasn't resisting. If anything, he looked almost resigned. Hours later, a statement was released. The lieutenant denied nothing, offering only one cryptic remark to the press. I'm just a small piece in a much bigger game. David leaned forward, replaying the clip. Jake, now bandaged and resting in the next room, glanced over. That sound like a confession to you? It sounds like he wants us to know something. David muttered. Jake exhaled. Or it's just a way to get a deal. Throw someone bigger under the bus so he walks with a slap on the wrist. David wasn't convinced. He had seen desperate men before. Davidson wasn't one of them. Within a week, the fallout spread through the department like rot. High-ranking officials were placed under investigation. Officers resigned overnight. The mayor called for sweeping reforms, while the governor promised independent oversight of the APD. It should have been enough. But David knew better. Reynolds had been a soldier, Davidson, a strategist, but neither of them had been the one pulling the strings. He could feel it, like a loose thread waiting to be pulled. And someone out there knew he was looking. Jake survived, but at a cost. The doctors said he was lucky. The bullet had missed anything vital, but nerve damage in his arm meant he'd never be the same. He made his decision before David could even ask. I'm done with law, Jake admitted, sitting at a small cafe days later, his arm still wrapped in a sling. This whole thing, it showed me that the system doesn't fix itself. David studied him. So what now? Jake smirked faintly. There's an organization that takes on cases like this. Civil rights violations, systemic corruption, that kind of thing. I think I'm gonna sign up. David nodded. gripping his coffee. You'll be good at it. Jake exhaled, then met his gaze. And you? David hesitated. What came next for him? He had spent his life uncovering the truth, believing exposure led to justice. But now he knew better. Justice wasn't automatic. Justice had to be forced. His phone buzzed. An email. No sender name. No subject. Just an attachment. David tapped the screen. A single file appeared. Classified. For your eyes only. A chill ran down his spine. He looked up at Jake. I think someone just handed me my next story. The city of Atlanta was in turmoil. The streets, once filled with silent fear, now pulsed with the voices of thousands. Protesters marched through downtown, their chants echoing off glass buildings. Signs demanding justice bobbed in the air. No more corruption. Justice for Ethan Cole. Reform the system now. The fallout from the scandal had reached every corner of the city. The Atlanta Police Department scrambled to contain the damage. The commissioner held emergency press conferences, promising an independent investigation. Officers were suspended. Federal oversight teams were brought in. But beneath the public spectacle, David knew the truth. They weren't trying to fix the system. They were trying to control the damage. Inside a small cafe on the west side, David sat across from Jake. The place was nearly empty, save for an elderly couple in the corner and the occasional sound of coffee cups clinking against saucers. Jake, his arms still in a sling, took a slow sip of his drink before speaking. So, what now? David exhaled. You tell me. Jake smirked. No, man, I mean you. What's next for you? David stared into his coffee, watching the steam rise. I don't know. And that was the truth. For years, he had believed that exposing corruption would bring change. That if the truth came out, justice would follow. But now, after everything, after the threats, the losses, after nearly dying for the truth, he wasn't so sure anymore. The department was still standing. The city's officials still held their positions. Yes, Reynolds was dead. Yes, Davidson was in custody. But they had been nothing more than enforcers. The real power? It was still out there. And it wasn't afraid of him. Jake leaned forward. Listen, man, you're tired. I get it. But you can't walk away from this. Not now. David met his gaze. And why not? Because if you do, Jake said, they win. David looked away, rubbing his fingers against his temple. Come on, Carter. You and I both know this isn't over. David sighed. Yeah. He glanced out the window, watching the world move around him. That's the problem. That night, David sat in his apartment, staring at the email still open on his screen. No sender, no subject, just an attachment. He had debated for hours. Opening it meant diving deeper, committing to something he wasn't sure he had the strength to finish. But if he ignored it, then what had all of this been for? His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then he clicked. The file loaded. Pages and pages of classified documents filled the screen. Names, transaction records, internal memos, and at the center of it all, something that made his stomach tighten. It wasn't just Atlanta. It was bigger than that. A network spanning multiple cities. Officers, judges, politicians, people in power, connected by something far more organized than just a few dirty cops. David's pulse quickened. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. A knock at the door. David froze. It was nearly midnight. No one should be here. He stood, moving cautiously, through the peephole. The hallway was empty. But when he opened the door, a single envelope sat on the ground. No return address, no markings, just his name. He picked it up, his fingers stiff as he tore it open. Inside was a photograph. Him, Jake, sitting in the cafe earlier that day. And beneath it, a single sentence scrawled in ink. Be careful, Carter. We're still watching. David felt his chest tighten. He looked down the hall. But there was nothing. No movement. No sign of who had left it. Just the silence. He turned back inside, locking the door behind him. Then, slowly, he walked to his desk and stared at his laptop. The investigation wasn't over. If anything, it had only just begun. The city moved on. In the weeks following the scandal, the protests slowed, the headlines shifted, the world, as it always did, turned its attention elsewhere. But David knew better. Justice wasn't a victory. It wasn't a finish line. It was a struggle. One that never truly ended. He stood in the newsroom of the Atlanta Gazette, staring out the window at the city below. Atlanta stretched out before him, bathed in the dull orange glow of streetlights. From here, it looked peaceful, normal. But beneath that surface, the same old machine still turned. The police department had made promises, suspensions, investigations, reforms. But David had seen the cycle before. They would make a spectacle of a few arrests, a few resignations, and then, quietly, the system would stitch itself back together. Stronger, smarter, better at hiding its corruption. He had exposed them once. But the real power? The ones who had protected Reynolds and Davidson. They were still out there. And they were watching. Jake was leaving. David met him outside a bus station on the city's edge. The rain had left the pavement slick, reflecting the neon glow of passing traffic. Jake slung his bag over his good shoulder, wincing slightly. "You sure you don't want to come with me?" David smirked. "And let you have all the fun?" Jake chuckled. "I'm heading to DC. The group I'm joining. These guys aren't just talking about change. They're making it happen." David nodded. "You'll be good at that." Jake studied him for a moment. "You sure about this, man? Staying here?" David exhaled. "For now." Jake hesitated, then extended his good hand. David shook it, gripping firmly. "Be careful," Jake said. "You too." Jake gave him one last nod before stepping onto the bus. David watched as it pulled away, disappearing into the night. Back at his apartment, David sat at his desk, the glow of his laptop casting shadows across the room. The classified documents still filled his screen. Waiting. He should have been exhausted. Instead, his mind was racing. Somewhere out there, the real architects of this corruption were still operating in the dark. Still pulling the strings. He could expose them, but not yet. Not until he had everything. A buzz. David glanced at his phone. A text. No name, no number. Just a message. "Ready for the next round?" David's breath slowed. They were waiting for him. He stared at the screen, then typed his response. "Always. The fight for justice doesn't end when the truth is exposed. It's only the beginning." David Carter risked everything to reveal the corruption hiding in plain sight. But even as one battle ends, another begins. The real question isn't whether the system can be changed. It's whether enough people are willing to keep fighting. How many more secrets are still buried? And how far will those in power go to keep them hidden? What do you think? Does true justice ever win? Or is it just a game of survival? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories that uncover the truth they don't want you to see, subscribe to Covert Truths.